ladies and gentlemen, it's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today our distinguished guest is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
It's always my pleasure. Jonathan, the last 3 4 days now, 3 days, there was a NATO summit in United States. It's 75 years since the inception of NATO. And surprisingly enough, there is not much coverage in major media, except, yeah, it was a summit, it was a good summit, the NATO is strong as never before, and so on. The details, I never really heard the details, except if you're following the Russian and Ukrainian sources. There you will find a lot of details that people here are completely unaware of. And I think to me, the major point is that the NATO is clearly prepares to treat Ukraine as their own war and to do anything possible and impossible to not just allow Ukraine to survive, but to get Ukraine to prevail and to win this war. Now, NATO countries, they wrapped up production. Forget about the stupid 2% or so on. You know what? I disagree with Donald Trump when he criticized NATO for not paying 2%. First of all, most of the countries did pay their 2%, and now, today, most countries are paying 2%, and some are paying 4% and more. But that's not the point. The point is that I'd like to make that once Soviet Union has collapsed and there was no more Warsaw Bloc, and Russia was weak as never in its history, there was a questioning, I think legitimate question, even on purpose of NATO. What's the purpose to exist? Is to resist Soviet aggression or Warsaw Pact aggression or both? Now, if there is no Warsaw Pact, if there is no Soviet Union, then what's the purpose? So when your purpose is not even clear to everybody, then you're reluctant to continue to pay 2%. Like, for what? There is no threats, there is no Soviet Union, there is no Warsaw Pact. So that was understandable. However, of course, we know situation changed in 2014, I would say even in 2008 with the aggression against Georgia. But it was kind of a small and it's a 3 5 days war, and that was all over very quickly. But the 2014 annexation of Crimea and taking over the Donbas territory, that was something different. Yet European powers thought that they could sort of deflate this affair, and they had all kind of agreements, like if you remember, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and all that other stuff, which never came to fruition. And I don't understand why Russia at that time didn't act the same as today, when they could actually insist on implementation of either Minsk 1 or Minsk 2, and in case that Ukraine would resist, start aggression then. Well, they didn't, but it was the year 2019 when Zelensky was already in power, and they were preparing sign some accords. Essentially, it was a Minsk 3. They didn't call it that way, not to be associated with unfortunate Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, long life. Minsk 3 or so, or you can call it any way you want, and that was, everything was prearranged, and in the very last moment, Zelensky said to Putin, my friend, I'm not going to sign it. That was incredible, knowing Putin's background as a bully, as the hooligan in the St. Petersburg streets. This is incredible, I would say, to turned completely Putin's vision of his world and how things are done and arranged and so on. Zelensky, with completely different background from Putin, he went 100% against that. And Putin decided then that obviously that will be punished and quite severely. And then we are going into all kind of ultimatums that continue to this day, the full-scale aggression and all that stuff. So today, of course, NATO is paying well more than required 2%. So that's no more the question even, because today there is a reason why NATO countries have to pay. There's another reason coming up. We don't know what's happened if and when Trump will become president. Based on his saying, we can't figure out what's in his head, but in his saying, he and his supporters obviously are saying that there will be no more help to Ukraine or so on. What will be in reality, we don't know. It could be reversed 100% or 50% or whatever. So we don't know that. But NATO to rearrange things and be independent of the United States, they did several things, or in a process of doing several different things. First of all, they ramp up their military production. They're now about to produce their own mid-range missiles. They are changing the structure of NATO. There will be no more Ramstein style of way to delegate and actually manage NATO affairs in Europe. There will be a new center which will be headed by three-stars general, and it will be not depending on United States. If United States want to participate, it's fine, but it's not going to be American-centered power in Europe. And they are treating now Ukraine as their own. Ukraine is a European country, unlike Russia. Ukraine was in European tradition, culture, religious, and any otherwise, unlike Russia. And therefore, if I even remember when I just came over to Canada, and I had to, from time to time, fill up different documents. And the place of birth, I always have written Odessa, USSR, because although Odessa is part of Ukraine and always was, Ukraine didn't have its independent status at that time. It was recognized, okay, there is Ukraine, but that's about it. They didn't have their own army, didn't have their own institutions or anything like this. So if I would say Odessa, USSR, it brings up the kind of a, I would say, system. What exactly are you and what's your government at the time or so on. But starting in 2014, it was Odessa, Ukraine. Although Ukraine became independent in 1991, but there was no strong identification of what's the difference exactly between Russia and Ukraine. They're developing more or less the same lines and so on, and they're kind of mixing together for most of the time. But 2014 changed all that. So NATO is now developing its own policies, its own style of management, and it's taking all European affairs in their own hands. I think it's reasonable, provided that they will follow up the course. They will indeed start to, or will develop eventually this mid-range missiles. And they will provide Ukraine with all possible assistance what they need right now. And the other thing is that there was a very robust discussion about the way Ukraine could become a member of NATO. Because now Putin repeat in some of his ultimatums that this temporary peace will be there, but if he is not satisfied with all the conditions that he will put upon Ukraine, then obviously they will invade Ukraine second time, and this time it will be final What I really don't understand, if he thinks that way, and quite possible he is, why he is declaring that? What's his purpose? Just intimidation, or he's complete psychopath? He doesn't care anymore what he says and what he does. It's very difficult. Jonathan, the floor is yours. Please address
Oh,
everything. You can disagree with me 100%.
I've been waiting for you to toss the grenade in my direction. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I'll tell you. Well, for one thing, if people had read my book back in 1993, The Russian View of U.S. Strategy, I had pointed out in the beginning of the book that Henry Kissinger saw this situation coming. He asserted that even though right now we should be wary of that Russia will eventually begin to reassert itself due to its great size, due to its resources. It will inevitably begin to reassert itself. We should not assume that Russia is going to remain quiescent or helpless forever. That's it. And I agreed with that, and especially because Russia still had in its possession, or was in the process of regaining complete control over its nuclear arsenal, the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union regarded its nuclear arsenal not only as one of the forces cementing the Federation, cementing the Soviet Union, but also giving it great power status. Boris Yeltsin had stated in 1994 in a speech to the Russian Duma that the only reason Russia is considered a great power is because its armed forces have nuclear weapons. About a more frank statement you could not possibly find. And that is central to, and because the Russian concept of security is безопасность, which is without danger, that is a more absolute and aggressive concept of security than we in the West are used to. When we think of security, we think of relative freedom from immediate threat, freedom from immediate danger. They say their concept is without danger, absolute. In order for Russia to feel secure, its neighbors must be made to feel insecure, subordinate, quiescent, or conquered. So
Does that includes Finland as well?
Well, Stalin found out that was a much harder nut to crack when they lost over 200,000. They lost over 200,000 soldiers in the Winter War of 1939.
Very quickly.
Very quickly too.
In a matter of months and a half.
Mm-hmm. So it was, and the Finns.
Hold on, Jonathan. But
Yeah.
do you know that they lost 4, maybe even 5 times more people in Ukraine now than in Finland?
Yes. Oh, yes. So they're learning a much harder lesson, and well, certainly we in the United States, most people in the United States, and certainly the vast majority of people in NATO, although greater number probably realize this, is that they did not have the same sort of threat. They basically were able to subordinate. Well, how shall I put it? They really was a very. They were able to inflict great casualties, and they were able to suppress. But the fact of the matter is that that Russia now has this this ability, this desire to restore the former Russian Empire. And their main means of doing so is their nuclear arsenal, their nuclear missile arsenal, which they use as a means of threatening the West, intimidating the West. And so this is a very awkward situation. But NATO has learned the lessons. They remember the lessons of World War II. They remember the price of not resisting promptly aggression by Nazi Germany in the phony war of 1939-1940. So now the NATO has effectively learned its historical lessons and is preparing to act independently of the United States, and hopefully at best with at least the firm's logistical support of the United States or increased numbers of weapons. And if they were to follow, if the Department of Defense decides to enhance its ballistic missile defenses, to create that worldwide strategic defense matrix, wisdom, that would be designed to neutralize the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Then this would be the perfect asymmetric response to Russia's aggression, and it would neutralize their main means of leverage, and it would provide the basis for creating indefinite strategic stability for Europe and NATO.
Jonathan, when you mentioned that Russian nuclear arsenal is a cornerstone of Russian ability to fight for its dominant position in the world affairs, there is something else going on of very few people are aware maybe of. The Russian web of spies and terrorists sponsored by the state. In fact, there was a try to kill one of the German nationals who is in charge of factories that would produce weapons for Ukraine. And that is not the only one act that they're trying to implement. Several spies and terrorists are acting in different European countries. And it's very easy to penetrate because once you are in the Schengen zone in the European Union, you can freely travel to any country of the European Union without needed any documents even to. I remember I was driving from Nice, from France. I was driving to Italy, Turin. So I had a map, but it was 2006, so it was a long time ago. It was before GPS and so on. So I was driving and I used map. Okay, so I knew more or less where I'm going, and according to my calculations, there's supposed to be a border. So I prepared my passport and so on, and I'm looking where is the border, and I started to worry that if there is no border, how I will go to enter Italy. Okay, so I kept driving, and all of a sudden, I finally noticed that all signs, instead of being blue, they became green. So, so I figured out that
Now I'm in Italy.
I'm in Italy now. So that was really funny, and that's why this Russian nationals, once they are in, and they can enter the European Union. Maybe it's through Hungary, maybe it's through some other obscure countries, not necessarily Germany or France, but through some other countries. But once there, they can freely to travel without worrying, even being investigated and shows the documents or so on. So this is a clear and real danger, really, from this Russian terrorists and spies and so on. And of course, they're all supported by states, so they have almost unlimited means to do their acts or so on. Now, I found very interesting details that the upcoming English Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was he was a lawyer of widow of Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed by Russian polonium experts. And actually, this is how he's a lawyer. This is how he found his way to fame, by providing legal services to widow of Litvinenko. So he definitely has background of what Russia is, what it's capable of. And the new prime minister of England, he is on the forefront of being one of the friends of both Ukraine and Israel. And so this change in power in England, it's, in my opinion, should be viewed as kind of positive overall to Ukraine. And at least that's what I hear. So the Russia is becoming a huge headache for all progressive humankind and for European Union and for US in a way too, because when you're talking about all this web of spies and terrorists, how you can insulate United States for not getting these actors inside the country and more importantly operate inside the country.
I would say that the proper model for the United States to adopt in the rest of the 21st century with respect to NATO is that it should adopt something similar to the policy that Great Britain adopted vis-a-vis the continent of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Essentially, Great Britain adopted the position of being a balancer. If you look at balance of power theory, essentially England would ally with whatever powers were needed to prevent any one power from dominating the continent of Europe. And so what I advocate in my book is that the United States in the future should be the world's geopolitical balancer, should basically ally in this case with the as part of the NATO alliance to unite against any combination of powers that threatens to try to dominate the world island. It is not so much containment as it is balance, because in this case, because Russia is so determined, according to the statements by their military and political leadership, to not only dominate Ukraine, but also to retake certain other countries and territories, if you were to take them at their words at face value, then it is necessary for the United States to provide that means of balance. And the most effective means of providing that balance would be for them to create that wisdom system, worldwide strategic defense matrix, that would neutralize the nuclear arsenals of its major adversaries. Once that is done, that once they don't have the nuclear arsenals with which to intimidate, then these powers like Russia, they could, we will build up our own strategic defense systems too. Knock yourself out. Because we don't have any intent to destroy your country with nuclear weapons. We simply want to neutralize your nuclear weapons so that you can't use them against us. And if they wish to expend all those additional resources trying to build up their own defenses, fine, it's a waste of time for them. But if they don't, if they don't devote any additional resources, they can't build up nuclear weapons because the wisdom system would essentially neutralize those. And if they don't build up any strategic defense, then they themselves remain vulnerable to NATO's ability to inflict a nuclear counterstrike. It would be NATO's means, using with the U.S. as geopolitical balancer, to maintain indefinitely a state of strategic stability in Europe, with Ukraine as its eastern bulwark.
Jonathan, a couple of examples regarding the membership of Ukraine in NATO, because in my opinion, that's the only thing what could guarantee Ukraine from further attacks from Russia. So even if in foreseeable future it would be very difficult for Ukraine to restore the borders of 1991. So for the time being, if you remember, of course, Korea's armistice, and but there is more to it. Even Norway had some difficulties to be accepted in NATO because there is a border between Norway and Soviet Union then.
A very, very narrow one, but
very narrow. I was very close to it. I was in Tromsø in 2014. Yeah, there was a chess Olympiad. My wife was playing there, and we were in Tromsø for about 2 weeks. And we traveled a little bit north, but not far enough to reach the border. We traveled picturesque places, and we traveled all the way up north. And then on the way back, we took the cruise ship back to Tromsø. It was very nice one-day excursion. And what else I wanted to mention, of course, is Germany. The Germany which was divided in two by Federal Republic of Germany and Eastern Democratic Republic.
Yeah, German Democratic Republic, yeah.
German Democratic Republic. So that was a very fine line because the West Germany was very careful as to not to agree to the present division, because they always thought that in some time in the future the German nation will be united again, and that's exactly what happened once the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, and so on. So, in case of Ukraine, if there will be some kind of a demarcation line on where they are now fighting on the front lines, so if imagine that it will become demarcation line, and Ukraine doesn't have to agree that all the rest of the territory is now Russian territory or so on, they can simply say, here is a demarcation for a time being, but the rest of Ukraine, which is not taken by Russian power, is becoming the proper country with its government and everything, all institutions and everything else, and its army, million people strong. So that could be probably accepted by NATO. What do you think?
I think that would be a very acceptable solution, and that just as NATO was able to accept West Germany minus what was then East Germany, they could accept that, and they were operating as full members of NATO. Yes, you could have a very similar situation emerging in the future with Ukraine minus, let's say, minus those four eastern provinces in eastern Ukraine.
It's part of province. It's not even a whole province.
It's not exactly those slivers of those provinces that
absolutely
have been occupied by Russia, and what would make it most workable, what would make such an agreement most workable and most feasible, is if in the interim, Ukraine was able to retake Crimea by enforcing that counteroffensive. And it is still my projection and my estimate that Ukraine will execute a counteroffensive sometime certainly before the November election. That could be their version of an October surprise.
John, by the way, if Ukrainians, according to you, will be successful and retake Crimea, then all this Russian installation to build this corridor from Donbass to Crimea, it's all losing sense, because you have to still defend this territory and do something with it. But what for? If you don't have Crimea, why do you need this corridor?
Correct. Which you would render their project useless. Which is all the more reason why Ukraine has this incentive, and I would argue a potential opportunity to execute a successful counteroffensive in advance of November elections, if you want to use that as an arbitrary deadline, to basically to force Russia to confront an operational defeat and essentially a political defeat, force them to retreat and essentially force them to declare victory and go home.
Excellent. Jonathan, I'm really glad to hear the words of wisdom from you, as usually. And looking forward to see you in our next program. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Enjoy yourself. And of course, as we say, glory to Ukraine. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.